If you ask many people about the story of Adam and Eve, I wonder if they would look at Genesis 1 and 2 and those creation stories, or I wonder if they'd be straight into Genesis 3 and looking at the fall and how things went wrong so quickly. Certainly at the start of Genesis 3 or the end of Genesis 2, Adam and Eve seem to be living in an actually perfect state. They seem to be in a perfect married relationship. Physically, they are naked, and yet they have no shame, and they hide nothing from each other. And it just seems like a perfect situation to be, and they walk with God regularly. However, Genesis 3 begins to tell us how things went wrong. Genesis 3 tells us how sin entered the world, and it also perhaps begins to hint at how sin can be overcome. So the serpent, it's interesting, we don't know very much about the serpent at all. Some people argue whether the serpent, as is described, is part of the created order. There are lots of questions about Genesis 3, which perhaps we'll discuss a little bit later. Is it literally true? Did Adam and Eve really exist? Is it an allegory or a myth? All sorts of different understandings of it. So the serpent comes and he asks Eve a question. It's the first question in the Bible, and really Eve needed to just turn away from this point, but she didn't. She entertained the serpent into conversation. And you'll note, if you look at the original commands in chapter 2 and Eve's reply in chapter 3, how she just subtly changes the language slightly. The first thing that the devil does in verse 4, he denies God's judgment. So to make this, what is a direct contradiction of God's command justifiable or reasonable, the devil invents a false motive for God. So the serpent stands in direct conflict with God. He has revealed himself. So he sets a trap for Eve, and she walks straight into it. The fruit looks good to her. She thinks she will better herself by eating it. And it's all to do, perhaps, when we think about our society, it's all to do with what Eve thinks rather than what God says. And so, of course, ultimately, Eve eats the fruit. She takes some of it and gives it to Adam. Let's not go down the road of saying, well, it was all Eve's fault, or it was all the serpent's fault. It was certainly the serpent's fault, and it was certainly Adam and Eve's fault, because they both knew the command, and they both broke God's rule and ate from the tree. In verses 8 to 24, we have the cool of the day. It could be translated as the wind or the spirit of the day. It's something to do with God's presence. And so God comes, and in verse 9, he asks questions of Adam and Eve. And Adam's response doesn't really express his own guilt. What he does, he now tries to blame everybody else, if you like. Now there is shame, there is guilt, and there is fear in paradise. All these things which were unknown to him before he disobeyed God. So now they're going to wear clothes, so God makes fig leaves to cover them up, and that paradise is lost, and that's altogether rather sad for them. We could ask ourselves, why don't they die immediately? Because was not that the command? And that's him, but they don't, and they are thrown out of the garden, and angels called the cherubim are sent to guard the Garden of Eden. Interesting point. Does the Garden of Eden still exist somewhere, hidden and guarded by angels to this day? Or is that too far-fetched for us to remotely believe? Verse 15 of chapter 3 is perhaps one of the most important verses in the chapter, because in this many people see a glimpse of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus Christ. The hostility between the snake and the woman and the man is going to continue, but then ultimately Eve's offspring, there's going to come a Messiah who would then be our Saviour and take our sin upon himself. Lovely story, Genesis chapter 3. We can make lots of it, and I'm sure we'll find lots of different views to discuss.